here. So I appreciate the question. Why did I get into soils, or how did I get into soils? So I was actually, I got a job. I had a minor in chemistry. My major was in biology. And I got a job as a soil technician, working on soil quality issues, soil fertility issues, for mostly for the cotton industry near Lubbock, Texas. And I just got really interested in soils, and I took my first soils class from a very eminent pedologist named B.L. Allen at Texas Tech. And I took that class as a kind of way of checking to see if I was interested enough in soils to pursue it as a graduate in a master's program. And the very first day, B.L. Allen started talking about soils and how they were differentiated into these layers, and that there was this structure and self-organization that happened in the soils, and something we call soil structure. And I was just immediately captivated by that idea from the very first lecture. And I knew from that very first lecture that that's what I wanted to study for the rest of my career. So it was a real eye-opening experience to be there for that first lecture by B.L. Allen. And true to that, I've been, even though I didn't study soil structure and those things that sort of captured my imagination in the first lecture, I didn't study those for my master's program or for my PhD, but I knew as soon as I had my faculty position, which my first faculty position was at the University of Kansas, I immediately started studying soil structure. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about today are really going to come from that pursuit and that fascination. Okay, so thanks everybody again for participating and taking time out of your busy schedule to hear about these potential changes that I'm going to talk about. So today I'm going to talk about climate's effect on soil properties, and in particular I'm going to focus on the soil pore space. It's not typically a property that we think a lot about, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and some of the findings from some recent research. So if we think about soil pore space, this is kind of some background and some introduction here. Some of you may already know many of these concepts, but just to get us all on the same page, the volume of the soil is occupied by either solids or pore space. So those are the two options that we have. It's either something solid in the solid phase, or it's something not in the solid phase. And so the solid phase can be divided up into either mineral or organic matter. And a really dark soil, one that you might go to, some topsoil that looks really, really dark, in a profile. If you happen to be walking past a road cut or walking past some recent construction and you see the upper layer is very dark, it might only have 3 to 5% organic matter, and that's all you need to really darken that soil. It doesn't take very much organic matter to darken the soil. But roughly about half of that volume is either mineral or organic, which means that the other half is pore space, and that pore space is filled with air or water. So if we think about what that means, if we stop and consider what that means for a minute, roughly half of the soil volume is pore space. I think it's rather remarkable. Imagine that we had a block of soil that was a meter by a meter by a meter. We had this large block of soil, and we had this sort of infinite piston that we could push all of the solid particles together and compress them perfectly together so that there's no pore space around the solid particles. We could take that 1 by 1 by 1 meter block and we could compress it to half its size. That's how much pore space there is. That is an enormous amount of pore space. And as a result, that means that there's a lot of space there for to hold on to things like water, and so it's very important for the water cycle. Now, as a way of just kind of gauging people's soil knowledge and as kind of an icebreaker, we've got a poll set up, and I want us to consider in this poll what effect soil texture has on this percentage where half of the volume is pore space and the other half is solid phase. What happens when you have a really sandy soil versus one that is really clay rich? which one is going to have more total pore space? So Emmy just put a poll online, so if you can go ahead and answer that.
All right, the answers are coming in. It's a pretty clear divide, so it's interesting to see which one is the right answer. All right, well, we've got 75% of the people voted. I'll give it maybe another 30 seconds to let everybody answer. All right, it's been a minute. So should I share the response?
Before you do, actually, I mean, let me just read the question again out loud to bring us all together. If you had a choice to push a wheelbarrow full of dry clay or a wheelbarrow full of dry sand all day at a construction site and wanted to do the least amount of work, which would you choose, the clay or the sand? So that's the question at hand. It may not immediately seem relevant to pore space, but obviously pore space is going to have a very strong impact on that. All right, so let's see the results. Okay, so that's about what I thought. That's pretty typical a response for sort of the first time to consider this. About 70% of you thought that it was the sand that you would be able to do the least amount of work. In other words, it would be the most porous. There would be less mass in that same volume of sand than in the clay. And there's a number of reasons for that. But let me go ahead and tell you that that is completely wrong. The clay it weighs a lot less than the sand does per unit volume. And the reason why is because that clay is very porous. It has a lot more pores in it. You might say, wait a second, I've seen sandy soils. I've been to the beach. I know what sandy soils look like. I can see the pores in there. I can't see them in clay. And you're exactly right. The sand, the pore space between the sand grains is very visible and very large. So the pore spaces are very large, and water can be transmitted very quickly through the soil. But if you think about the clay, each individual clay particle is about 2 micrometers in size. So the spaces between them, there's tons of spaces between them. And so whereas the sand grain is completely solid, so an individual sand grain, there's no pore space inside, it's just a grain of quartz or feldspar or whatever mineral it's made of. Whereas the individual clay particles, there's lots of them, they're very, very small. And so that creates a situation where you have much, much more porosity, even though those pores are very, very small. So the pore space is a lot smaller than in the sandy soils, but the sand has much larger pores, but a lower total porosity. So, so hopefully that was interesting and eye-opening to some of you, and I hope that will. I'll come back to this idea as we go through the talk here, but just a bit of an icebreaker there to think about soil pore space. Okay, so if we bring the soil pore space back to the water cycle, how is this relevant to the water cycle? Well, we already said that all of this pore space can hold on to water. So this enormous amount of pore space in the soil allows soils to hold on and retain lots of water. But in addition, and something we don't think about as much, is that the size of those pores is also important for controlling the speed with which water moves through the soil. So the pore space is really important. So the sizes are actually key to controlling the fate of that water, whether that water is going to be retained near the plant roots and be uptaken by plants, or whether it's going to drain, or whether it's going to even enter the soil at all from the very beginning. And so we call that property the pore size distribution, which is just, we could imagine drawing out a histogram of all the pores that exist in the soils and their sizes, and that would be the pore size distribution. Now, to understand why this is so important, again, this is a little bit of background, and I'll get to the study in just a second, but to understand why it's so important, the amount of water that moves through an individual pore is proportional to the 4th power of its radius. So in other words, the size of the pore dictates how much water you can move through that pore under a given potential energy gradient. And so it's really important. It's this fourth power that really makes a big difference. What it means is that even small change to pore size, you don't have to make very much change to pore sizes, but even a small change to pore size can create wildly large changes in the ability of the soil to transmit water because of this fourth power proportional constant. And so this is really important here. This relationship is called Poiseuille's law. It's well known, but it's one of the reasons that we think we were able to discover something that had been kind of flown under the radar for a very long time, because the change that we're talking about is very, very minor. It's very slight, very subtle. But because of this relationship, that small change is going to make a world of difference on the ability of soil to transmit water. Now, going back to the pore size distribution, this is, I think, the last sort of intro slide that I have here. But going back to the pore size distribution, the way that we quantify that or measure it or assess it in the soils is through this, or one way to do this is through the water retention curve. And what the water retention curve does is it relates the amount of water that's in the soil to the energy that it takes to extract that water from the soil. All right, so for instance, on this side, Emmy, can you see the mouse moving here?
Yes, it's not moving right now, but
Oh, okay.
yeah, we can see it.
Okay. This side of the curve, which is near the total porosity, this is, if we imagine that the soil had this much water in it, it would be nearly saturated. In other words, it's all of the pore space is filled with water here, again, about half the volume in this particular example. And as we get drier and drier, right, we move to the left, we move down this curve. And what happens is it takes an enormously large amount of energy to pull that water out of the soil the drier it becomes. In other words, the water is contained in smaller and smaller pore sizes that require a greater amount of energy for the plant to pull out. In fact, at some point, the plant can't pull out the water anymore, right? So at that point, we call that the permanent wilting point. And that's usually estimated at around 1,500 kilopascals, or minus 150,000 centimeters of water. So at that point, the water can no longer come out of the soil. So there might be a lot of water contained in the soil. The soil might still be relatively wet, but because the water is contained in those really small pores, the plants can't pull them up. On the other side, on the wet side of the curve, so this is the dry side of the curve. On the wet side of the curve, we have the effective porosity, which is between total porosity and field capacity. And this is that fraction of the pore space. This is the largest pores in the soil. What this is if field capacity is a little bit of a squirrely term to define, but generally it's defined as, imagine that the soil gets wet from a heavy rainstorm event, and then you let it dry, or sorry, it drains for 2 or 3 days. The amount of water that's contained in the soil after it's drained for a couple of days is the field capacity. And what that refers to is the reason why the water was draining in those first couple of days is because the pores that were draining were those largest pores. And again, that's because the energy at which it takes to move the water through the soil, or rather to extract the water from the soil, is inversely proportional to the radius of the pore. So here at this low energy side, we have very large pores, and so gravity is able to drain these waters until field capacity. So we call this term effective porosity, and I'm just going to refer to it as either effective porosity or the largest pores in the soil. And that's the part that we focused on in this study. So this study was motivated. It was several collaborators and I that worked on this study, and we had some preliminary data and some surprising findings that showed that this part of the pore size distribution, the largest pores, might be very sensitive to climate. So we had some inclination along the lines from some modeling work that we did. And what we decided to do was to put this idea to the test with a large-scale Continental data set. So we used a data set from the US Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They maintain a data set called the Soil Characterization Database. So basically they go out and map the soils across the country, and they store that information in a large database. And most of the data are contained within about 50 years. So the data run from about 1950. We actually have samples that are much older than 1950, but the majority of them are from 1950 and beyond. And we selected out of this data set two kinds of layers: surface layers and subsurface layers. The surface layers we defined as those between 0 and 25 centimeters. We were interested in trying to establish this relationship to climate with what was happening at the surface compared to what was happening down below the surface. Essentially what was happening in the root zone and what was happening down below. And so this gave us a convenient break to look at these. The A horizon, an A horizon is an organically enriched soil near the surface. And we also selected AP horizons, and the P there stands for plowing. So it has been, there's been some kind of evidence of tillage or plowing or disturbance on the land surface for the AP horizons, whereas the A horizons are mostly wildland soils. And I'll go into why we chose the AP in just a minute. And then the B horizons are just subsoil horizons that are genetically related to the soil. But the thing to keep in mind there is that they're lower horizons. They're subsurface horizons that fall between 25 centimeters and 100 centimeters. Now, in addition to that, we also looked at climate data. We took the climate data from the U.S. Historical Climatology Network. And the reason why we used this data set was because, well, it's a nice complete data set that has pretty good coverage across the country. But more importantly, it had continuous data for about 50 years. So that matched the same data set that we were looking at with the soil data set. So they're both about 50-year data sets. Okay, so okay, Amy, just to reiterate here, you can't see the mouse moving on the green.
We can see it.
Great. So what I want to show here, these are a few maps. The first two maps up here in green, the upper maps, are showing the effective porosity for the A horizons on the left and the B horizons on the right. Again, surface and subsurface. We'll ignore the AP horizons for a second and just look at the A and the B horizons. And this is an interpolated map of the data for what we found in the data set. And what you see, I guess the striking thing about this green map here on the left is that there's not really a good climate pattern. If you look at it, you can see the Rocky Mountain system here has relatively a high effective porosity, or a high large amount of pores, whereas the Atlantic coastal plain, which differs quite a bit in rainfall, also has the same amount of effective porosity. So this does not look like a very climate-like pattern. And the same thing goes for the B horizons. You can see Maine is very high, whereas Nevada is also very high, yet both of those are very different in their climates. So this was sort of the initial result. It wasn't too surprising, especially when you remember that what we just talked about with soil texture, the largest pores are highly dictated by the amount of sand and clay that you have in the soil. So what we used a technique, and I'm happy to discuss the details of that technique if people have questions, but we used a technique to remove the effect in the data on the effective porosity by texture. So we were able to remove the texture effects on this effective porosity. And when we did that, we were left with that portion of the effective porosity that was not explained by texture. And what we could see here is that indeed we see a very climate-looking pattern, for lack of a better term. You can see here, for instance, you can see the 100th meridian line, which is a typical atmospheric phenomenon that happens where it divides the wetter eastern part of the country with the drier western part of the country. And then again, it gets a little bit wetter closer to the coast, just like we would see in the climate pattern. So So this shows a very climate-like pattern, and the B horizons follow that same basic pattern with a little bit of distortion with how the size of that the high values of effective porosity. But the thing to notice here is that under dry conditions we have a high effective porosity. Under wet conditions we have a relatively low effective porosity. This was somewhat surprising. Most of the time. So I'm a pedologist, so I study soil genesis, and generally, the more water you have moving through the soil, the better developed the soil is. And so our thinking was that the more water you have through the soil, the more structure you would have in the soil, the more defined structure you would have, and the better that effective porosity or that large porosity would be. But in fact, we found actually the opposite of what we expect. So this was a big surprise and a big find. It was consistent with our earlier modeling work, so that was good, but it was still a surprise to us to find this, and kind of went against convention when we first saw this. We've since confirmed this a number of different ways. All right, so I apologize immediately for this plot. I know this is a lot of data. So I'm going to just walk you through this slide and to show you this is kind of where the heart of the story lies. So I want to show you this data. So first, if we look at the bottom x-axis of each of these plots, each column is showing the same x-axis. We have 4 different climate variables on the x-axis. So we have essentially the total amount of rainfall in the year in the first one. We have the growing season vapor pressure deficit. This is a measure of atmospheric humidity. So it's drier on the right and wetter on the left. Then we have the precipitation event magnitude, which is similar to mean annual precipitation, except that this is the average magnitude per rainfall event, but it's a similar to mean annual rainfall. And then lastly, we have freezing frequency, and this is a measure of freeze-thaw processes in the soil, freezing frequency, which is also dictated by climate. Now on this upper row, I just want to draw your attention to this upper row. These are the A horizons up here. So these are, again, these surface horizons that exist between 0 and 25 centimeters. And what we see is that for these surface horizons, this was a way of sort of looking at these climate-looking patterns. We wanted to look to see which variables are really explaining these patterns. And what we see is that under conditions where we have very low rainfall, so very dry conditions, we have slightly higher effective porosity or larger pores or a larger abundance of the largest pores in the soil are here. Whereas when we get wet, we get lower amounts of effective porosity. Now this holds true for the next one too, with mean maximum June, July, August pressure deficit. Here we have the wettest soils or the wettest conditions, and here the driest conditions. And then it switches back here. These are the driest conditions and these are the wettest. And then we see a little bit of a trend with freezing frequency as well. Down in the B horizons, we see the same trend. And by the way, I should note that this not only confirms the trend that we saw in the climate maps, and it allows us to quantify that trend and the nature of that trend, so we can make predictions. Is the reason why we're showing these plots. And so the B horizons show the same trend as the A horizons, although the freezing frequency is basically, there's not really a relationship with freezing frequency, but that makes sense because we're deeper into the soil, and so the temperature is much more mitigated by that depth of the soil that's there. Now here's the exciting part. So this was the really exciting part. I remember I was meeting with my colleagues when we were working on this, and we plotted this for the first time, and we were very excited to see this. We thought this is what's going to make the story really big, and it's this middle row right here. And I'll just focus on this first left plot here. So AP horizons, as I already mentioned, P means that the soil has been plowed. So there's evidence of plowing, mechanical disturbance. Now, much of the United States has been plowed, so we can find these AP horizons everywhere across the continent. And so what we expected to find was that the plowing which is an enormous pressure on the soil to plow the soil. It's a major change in the soil when you plow the soil. This is not a slight change. That this would overwhelm any climate signal that we're picking up in the data set across the continent. And so what we expected to see was that if the climate was not operating very quickly, that which we didn't expect. We didn't really have a time frame for the climate, the activity of the climate at this point. But what we reasoned was that if this trend still holds after we look at just those horizons that had been disturbed by plowing, this is an indication that the effect of climate is much more rapid than we expected. People had thought that these slight changes happen on the scale of centuries to millennia. But what we were able to demonstrate in these plots here is that climate can cause a change in these properties even after plowing, and so that was remarkable, was to see that. So these trends here are still held even after plowing. Now, because of the details of our data set, where the inferred date of plowing and the date that the sample was taken is usually within a year to about a decade, this allowed us to constrain the time frame over which the soil, over which the climate is operating on the soil to modify this property in the soil. So what this tells us is that the climate is operating as such a powerful forcing on the soil, even though it's not a very big change. Notice we're talking about very, very small changes here in the effective porosity, but nonetheless, the climate is acting in such a way as to cause this to happen within a year to a decade or so in the data set. So pretty exciting, much more quickly than we expected. All right, so you might say, okay, these are really small changes. Sure, there's a trend, but what difference does it make? Well, we examined the implications of this by taking the effective porosity. One of the other reasons why we used effective porosity was that we can take it and we can use it to calculate how the ability of the soil to transmit water. Again, most of the water is going through those large pores anyway. The small pores are much less important compared to the largest pores when it comes to transmission of water. So we were able to estimate that with the effective porosity and then use those relationships to predict what would happen at the end of the century under a middle of the road climate simulation. So this RPC6 scenario is a middle of the road. It's a upper middle of the road kind of scenario. It's not as aggressive as you could do and expect to see changes in the future. And what we looked at were 5 different regions across the continent that were expected to change in precipitation. So the amount of rainfall was going to change in those, or is predicted to change in those regions. And so we wanted to see, well, what would happen to the ability for the soil to transmit water relative to its current ability to transmit water using these relationships at the end of the century. What we found was that the change in KS, or this what's called saturated hydraulic conductivity, or this ability to transmit water, may be on the order of -55 to +34% for these 5 regions in the US. This is pretty remarkable. It's remarkable for a couple of reasons. One is, remember that the trend is that as you get wetter, so you get more rainfall, you lose those macroporosities. Your large pores go down, your effective porosity goes down. And so as a result, your ability to transmit water, your ability to get water into the ground and then transmit it, also goes down. So under those conditions, we're getting more rainfall where the land is less likely to absorb that water. And so this negative 55% change is a massive change to different regions across the country, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, where we saw the largest change. So that's sort of the implication of these really small, subtle changes in the pore size distribution. So the conclusions of the study here, so a couple of conclusions here is that one is that the land atmospheric models, because people had thought that these changes are not really being driven by climate on a time scale that was really relevant to the climate simulations, there was no need to include them as a dynamic feedback. Whenever you you update those properties as the model goes on, you greatly increase the computational time and complexity of the models. And so, so for a lot of different reasons, it was just assumed that those were static over the range of like a century when, you know, where these are being modeled. Well, what this data, what our study shows is that this might actually be a very large mistake. Is that by not incorporating the effect that climate has on this property, it likely has a feedback that's moving into the future. So it's something we're exploring right now. Another thing that we're exploring is the mechanisms behind the change. We're able to document in this study the reasons for, or excuse me, the evidence for the change, but not necessarily the reasons for the change. And we've got other studies also at different scales that show the same results at about the same magnitude in the same direction. So all of this confirms the study, the evidence that we were seeing at the continental scale. However, what we're working on right now is trying to understand why this is happening. And we think that there's different mechanisms going on. We think there's different mechanisms for the surface and the subsurface. But one of the main mechanisms we think is happening is that as you increase the amount of water in the soil, you increase the moisture in the soil water. What you're doing, in essence, is allowing more organic carbon to be decomposed. You're allowing much of the organic carbon that's contained in aggregates to be accessible by microbial decomposition. And what that's going to do is it's going to destabilize the aggregate. So you might be increasing the total carbon stocks in the soil as you increase the soil moisture, but you are also changing the efficacy of that organic carbon to bind particles and create these aggregate structures that give you those large spaces between the aggregates. And so as a result, we think what's happening is you're getting erosion of the sides of the aggregates that are clogging those pores, and so you're getting a reduction of macroporosity under more humid conditions. But we're exploring that right now. That's sort of a working hypothesis. The other thing is that the predicted changes in saturated hydraulic conductivity suggest that the water cycle will intensify under most climate scenarios. So this is a picture here, two pictures here from Riverside, San Bernardino counties that in 2014 they got a pretty significant amount of rainfall and created a lot of flooding in these areas. And so again, just to reiterate here, under wetter conditions, we're expecting that the land is going to have less ability to absorb that water and more ability to transport that water via surface water runoff, which would create more flooding, more erosion, more contaminant transport, a waste in water resources for communities, and also a potential reduction in the movement of that water vertically in the soil column to recharge aquifers as well. So all of these, are having some effects under areas that are expected to increase in precipitation. So this study was published a couple years ago in Nature, and so I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on the study, Daniel Jimenez at Rutgers, Attila Nemisch at Nibio in Norway, Ruth Carey at Brigham Young University, and Nate Brunzel and Cassie Wilson at the University of Kansas. Okay, so I think that's it, Emmy.
All right. Wow, that was a lot of information, and thank you so much for explaining this study, this significant study, to all of us. We are doing a Q&A right now, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm sure we all need a moment to kind of process all the information you presented, and maybe the questions will come up. We don't have any questions right now, but I have a question. So
should I stop the share right now?
You can keep it for
okay, sure.
Yes. Yeah, so you mentioned that, with climate change, the changes in the soil property is accelerating, and what that implies for the water cycle. You said that it intensifies water cycle. So at Tree People, we're very watershed management, especially in the urban area, is really important to us. And as a educator, I often teach students about the importance of infiltrating water into the soil to replenish the groundwater and to reduce stormwater pollution and just capturing water. So our solutions, we talk about picking up litter, we talk about taking out concrete, we talk about planting native plants and trees to increase that infiltration. But does your study kind of, I don't know how to word it, but will climate change kind of negate all of those efforts? And what, if so, like what are some real solutions to maintaining a healthy water cycle where the groundwater is being replenished and the soil porosity is at its ideal, or I guess effective porosity, right? That's what you want.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is, at this point we don't know, because we're trying to isolate what those mechanisms are and understand the change before. Once we understand the change, why the change is happening and what the predominant mechanisms are. I mean, we're pretty sure that microbial decomposition of organic carbon is really a major factor. But what's unclear is to what degree does shrink swell processes happen. For example, what's also happening in this change in climate is that we're getting different frequencies of wetting and different frequencies of precipitation events, which can create a situation where we're getting more or less frequency of wetting and drying, which can stabilize or destabilize aggregates as a result. And so we're not quite sure whether it's an abiotic or a biotic mechanism. Our thinking, because of the timing of this, we think that it's largely a biological mechanism. And so, to the degree that we can replant, to the degree that we can restore native ecosystems in these different environments, particularly like in urban environments and urban and peri-urban forests, for instance, the more likely we're going to have healthy microbial and plant communities that are going to be able to promote aggregation and be resilient. That's one thing that we don't really know yet, is sort of the level of resilience. And we show the trend, but you notice there's a pretty big, I'll go back here. There's a pretty big, these are pretty thick point clouds, and so while we're showing this overall trend at the continental scale, and we do show this at the plot scale too in different studies. But this is an indication that there may be some resilience that the soil has. In others, a more healthy soils that are more managed well will be able to resist this sort of change in order to buffer the effects of climate change.
Thank you so much. So we have a few questions from our audience. The first one is from Joanne. Is anyone studying the influence that living soil aspects, microorganisms and large organisms, might have on the work you just explained?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's sort of two parts there: the microorganisms, and what was the second part? The
larger organisms.
Larger organisms, yeah. So unfortunately, in terms of like the relative amount of studies in the literature on the microorganisms versus the larger organisms, the microorganisms are way higher than the larger organisms, and that's kind of unfortunate, because it doesn't take much for a large organism, burrowing fauna, for instance, to make a huge impact. Ants, termites, larger burrowing fossorial mammals like badgers and voles and gophers and things like that. Even trapdoor spiders and other sorts of organisms. All of these have a major impact on the soil. However, it's interesting that there is, and it's such a great question, because this is an area that just needs more research to sort of tease out those two effects. In this particular study, and the way that the Natural Resources Conservation goes about studying soils, in fact, the way in which a lot of soil science is actually done, they'll dig pits, particularly to get some kind of representative. Digging a pit is a lot of work, and so getting the soil information takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And so you want to be strategic about how you do it. So you don't usually get a ton of soil samples. You try to find one area within a surface, a landform surface, that represents that area. And so you dig a pit. But so as a result of doing that, you oftentimes, when people sample the soils, they oftentimes avoid places where there's higher activities of larger critters. And so as a result, what happens is there's a bias in the data set away from those processes. So we didn't look at those directly because our data set essentially was already biased away from those. So we're essentially looking at those already filtered from that effect. But we really don't know the extent at a continental scale what this would, what the larger organisms and how they're responding to climate and their behaviors responding to climate, how that's going to impact the change in porosity, aggregation, piping in the soil, and the movement of water through the soil. So excellent question.
Awesome, thank you. So another question from Jason. He asks, so if overwatering reduces pores, does that mean we should till the soil if we might have been overwatering?
Yeah, that's a good question too. As we show in the data set, apparently the tillage doesn't have a lasting effect relative to the climate. So there is obviously you can change the structure tomorrow on a soil. You can change these macropores tomorrow if you want by taking a John Deere tractor that can plow the state of Maine in about 30 minutes. You can take that out there and you can rip the soil. You can change the pore size distribution right now. However, what our study is showing is that the climate effects within a year to a decade will make it go back to where so there's this constant forcing to essentially go back to this point where it was before, at least in terms of aggregation. Now, many people in the literature right now are studying what are called alternative stable states to see if there are things that you can create, ways of managing the soil or maybe perturbations in the soil that will create a situation where it won't go back, where essentially you get stuck in an alternative stable state and the soil moves there. We're not quite sure if this is one of those type of properties that will do that or not. There is some evidence in really organic rich soils from peatlands in England that show that this may be the case, that it might actually be an alternative stable state. They found the same trends that we found, but looking at organic soils. And organic soils are a little bit of a different animal than what we typically think of as mineral soils.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. We have a couple more questions. From Victoria, what happened to water and soil during the Dust Bowl before the 1950s, given plowing was rampant in the Midwest then?
Yeah, that's another great question. So we have lots of plowing that happened prior to the Dust Bowl and during the Dust Bowl, and of course, we had a very large atmospheric phenomenon, a very large drought that happened, and so much of that is a little bit different than what I'm discussing here, because those plowing techniques did things that changed the surface of the soil that created so much wind erosion. And that's because of desiccation of the surface. And then the wind would, under these very dry conditions, would pick up the soil particles and just blow them all over the landscape. And of course, you can see pictures of this all over, from that time period. But they would carry them as far as from the Midwest, even as far as Washington, D.C. In fact, I think it was when Congress was getting out one session, and they walk outside, and somebody had timed the talk about soil conservation to match when the session was going to leave, that there was a big dust cloud that hit the Congress at about the same time. And so that's when Washington started doing something about it, when it was in their back door, essentially. So yeah, it's a big impact on wind erosion. So as a result, that changed the properties due to this process, this additional process of wind moving those particles across the landscape, eroding the surface, exposing some of the subsurface, bearing many features. And so that's a little different, because you can get like plugging that happens as a result of the dust being laid down from that erosion and that ultimate deposition downwind. So I'm not sure. I don't think that answered the question, but I think it's a little bit of a different phenomenon.
So there was a part 2 to that question. Did effective porosity size change even before the 50s?
Oh, good question. Yeah, it likely did. We we um, we don't have data from them to know whether that was the case or not. I suspect that it did, but we don't know for sure.
Okay, so this is another question. It's a question from Gina. Is the soil in urban areas considered AP or a different horizon entirely?
Yeah, that's getting into the weeds of soil taxonomy and soil descriptions and horizonation. Some of the soils in those areas are considered AP. Oftentimes, however, the convention is there are other conventions to describe soil materials where there are. So, for example, if the soil is in place and you disturb it by tillage, for instance, then you would get, or by compaction, you would get something like an AP horizon. However, in urban environments, you also get a lot of human altered material. So you get movement of one type of material into the soil. You might be digging in the soil and you find a diaper. Okay, so that's not natural. Or bricks or asphalt, concrete, etc. And so in those cases, what is typically done is that since the material has been disturbed, it's not native or in situ to the place. There's typically there's a different designation. There's typically a caret that's given before the name, and sometimes sometimes it's given just a C horizon, which means it hasn't been genetically altered yet, and so it's given like a caret C. In some cases, there is an M layer, which is for man-made materials, like a buried asphalt layer, for instance. So there's some differences there. But in some cases, as long as the material was just in place, but it has been plowed or disturbed or compacted, but it's basically in place, then yeah, an AP horizon would work. Sorry, I wasn't sure how much specificity to give there, and I could keep going on that topic, but
I think that was a great answer. So our last question, if you have more questions, please answer. These are really great questions. Thank you so much. Is from our resident soil expert, Yujuan. She says, thank you, Daniel, great presentation. Could you please elaborate a bit more on how the findings might apply to LA context, especially in urban settings? In other words, are there any recommendations for policy and decision makers to better mitigate current and future climate change impacts?
Yeah, Yujuan, that's a great question. So yes, we think that there are policy implications. Kind of to go back to my answer to Emmy's question, though, is that I think it's really important, and probably the most responsible thing for us to do is to really nail down the reason for why this is happening and understand the mechanisms behind it before we immediately march into policy about how to change it. Because there's been a lot of things that have been done in the name of environmental protection and good things that actually have very negative side effects that we didn't expect at first. It's one area of research that I'm involved in is the presence of a particular kind of fragile soil that exists in the desert areas called a V horizon, which is that upper layer of desert soils. And these have been disturbed by solar panels in the desert, which are we think of solar as being a really good thing, and it is, but the disturbance that happens has had this teleconnected effect from there, where we disturb that, wind picks up that material in this very fragile horizon, and it gets blown to the Sierras and changes the libido on the snowpack, which increases the ability for that snow to absorb solar insolation, which in turn changes the hydrologic cycle on the Colorado River as a result of what's happening with respect to solar panels in the desert. So there's lots of things like this where I think we want to make sure we understand why the change is happening in this case before we make a recommendation, because it might have the exact opposite effect of what we expect. So I guess I hesitate to recommend policy changes at this point, except to provide more funding for research on this topic. And sorry if that's a self-serving answer. But I think that that's really important for us to understand why this is happening. Again, I think the most fruitful explanation will be related to biological change, but it does open up just as a positive note, it does open up the possibility for understanding that certain arrangements of the particle are most either most stable or most conductive for ecological functioning within a particular environment, so that we could aim to try to get that kind of fabric using natural means like planting different species or putting more organic carbon into the ground or whatnot. So I think these are all ways that are very promising in the future. We just don't think we know enough about it. That's this study that I've got up here on the screen here came out 2 years ago in 2018. So this is still a really new, kind of hot off the press sort of idea.
Thank you so much for those answers, and thank you for the questions, everybody. If there are any other questions, please ask now. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Daniel Hermas for being here today with us. You took time out of your busy schedule to impart this soil knowledge on us. And, you know, I've been in conservation for many years, but I don't know anything about soil science. So for me, it's really, really eye-opening, and it just, you know, encourages all of us to keep doing what we're doing, to create a healthier watershed, to create healthier ecosystems. And thank you for, you know, doing this research that is so important for the future and climate change and all of the planet Earth. So thank you. And yeah, our next topic will be in 2 weeks, and it's going to be on fire ecology. So that's something very, very relevant right now, especially. So we hope you tune in and keep following us at Learn at Home and keep learning with us. We also have 2 short videos that went out this week with the soil theme. One is about vermicomposting in the apartment, and the other one is about doing a soil percolation test at home. So yeah, thank you for being here, and see you guys next time.
Thanks. Thanks, Emmy.
Wait, before you go.
Oh yeah, sure.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm just sharing. All right. Yeah, everybody's gone. I just want to say thank you.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for the invite.